Okay, let's get started, because I know if you're anything like me, my belly's already rumbling and it's only 3 minutes past 11. So thank you everyone for joining me today. I'm going to talk through assessment plans, endpoint assessment and approved endpoint assessment organisations, which NCFE is on the register and approved by the ESFA for a number of standards. But I'm going to talk more general today in order to just give you an overview and to just share some intelligence and knowledge and what we've learned over the last 19 months of me working on this project in terms of the assessment plan, endpoint assessment, and obviously how we all become endpoint assessment organisations. So really it's the journey from the start to that finishing point of EPAOs getting on the register today. Hopefully you'll find all of that nice and useful, because it's that informative information as to why are we in the place that we are today with standards. So I will cover the assessment, so the plans, the endpoint assessment and the endpoint assessment organisation, investigate the complete apprenticeship trailblazer timeline so that you can fully understand what's involved before you actually get a standard approved as well. Explore how endpoint assessment organisations also get on the register, because this is really important. I think we get asked a lot of the time that as soon as a standard's released, oh, are you on the register? So it's really good, I think, for you guys to fully understand what we have to do in order to get on the endpoint assessment register as EPAOs, which is kind of similar but a little bit different to the process and the timescales that you wait when you have to get onto the ROTAP as well. So we have to go through the same submission, audit and due diligence process as well for every standard. So once you're on, you can't just add any standard, but each standard is a separate application as well. Any questions throughout, if you just want to pop them in your question box or in the chat box, I'll try and keep control of what's coming through. Might not be able to answer all of them as we're going through, because I do obviously want to try and finish in a timely manner for you guys and let you get away for your sandwich. But I'll try and pick out the poignant ones that don't disturb me too much and lose my flow. And at the end of the session, we will have this fully recorded, and the slides will be shared with you with the recording, and also the answers we will share with any questions that do come through and don't get answered today will be shared with you alongside that with the follow-up, which you should expect within a week of today. So without further ado, we'll get started. So it feels like this year has just been a constant amount of change, and rightly so, it has. We started the year with one funding rules, version 1. We're now up to version 6. We're just coming to the end of the academic year almost, being in May time, 2 more months to go. Not that I'm wishing the year away or wishing time away, but it seems to be going so fast. We've had 34 different white papers that affect further education, so the FE sector alone. So if you're not working just in apprenticeships, there's been an awful lot for you all to read this year. To keep up to pace with the change. I think there has also been a lot of decisions made throughout this year, even with delivering of standards. We've seen new standards coming out. We've seen the extension of SAFE frameworks till 2020. The funding ban changes were implemented this session. We've had the year of the levy and non-levy funding. We have also had 10% contributions for employers, which differs considerably between the SAFE framework amount that they would have to contribute because of the way that they're funded to a similar standard, because the standard would draw down more funding. Therefore, the 10% contribution for an employer would be higher for a standard or an apprentice going through a standard delivery. So there has been massive amounts of change just in one academic year. But this all started way back when, in November 2012, with the Richards Review. And I'm almost certain most of you will have read the Richards Review, but there's just some highlights there, essentially, of what that report's recommendations were from Doug Richardson, in the sense of redefining what apprenticeships were, greater focus on the outcome or the skill level and ability of the apprentice at the end of the actual journey on the apprenticeship. There was calls for improvements on quality, and he specifically stated that they needed to be more focused on the needs of employers. And this all kind of came about in that coalition government with the Conservatives and the Lib Dems. It was also recognised within the review that apprenticeships should be there for a learner or an apprentice who was acquiring either a new job or a new job role, who required sustained and substantial training, which we obviously see that reflection now within the funding rules. But essentially, this was the involvement and the recommendation for endpoint assessment. To have a truly trusted, independent assessment essentially is key to the journey, which is what came out of Richard's review. And therefore, he also suggested that the core purchasing power for investment lies with the employer, which is why we've seen a significant shift in the levy funding and the non-levy funding. And I'm almost certain that we'll continue to see the greater change, because the ambition is that all employers will have a digital account, whether it's funded via the levy or the non-levy, and therefore they will then have the greater power in determining who they would use then for the delivery of their apprentice programme for the upskilling of that new skill or that new job or that substantial training, essentially. From the Richard review, we then moved along into 2013, where the next steps or the implementation plan of all of these changes came about, which is kind of the effects that we're feeling now all the way in 2018, which is all the implementation of endpoint assessment organisations, that independent and managing the conflicts of interest. It was the recommendation that employers would lead on the development of standards, therefore the trailblazer groups. And really everything that we see today is in that implementation plan coming into fruition. The middle part of the journey was the Institute for Apprenticeships and developing their process, which I've got the link. So when we share it with you at the end or within the next 5 working days anyway, I'll bring that hyperlink up so that you can actually see the long link of where you find that developing and writing apprenticeship outcome occupational standard. But essentially that particular link brings you to a really comprehensive guide by the IFA on how to actually go about setting up your trailblazer group, if that's what you have an investment, or if you've got employers asking you how they go about recommending a new standard, or how they go about setting up a trailblazer group, which I know that we've been asked quite numerous times. This is the best place to kind of signpost them to, which is all about identifying that apprenticeship occupational gap and forming your trailblazer group, and essentially how they then compose their proposal for the standard, how they devise their plan for endpoint assessment and the rules around the endpoint assessment and the number of components that they would need to select and the type of components they would need to select, allocating the funding band and the process of obtaining the funding band that we now know sits with a number of approved standards. And again, there's another link that I've shared, and again, I'll expand that out, which is the requirements of forming that trailblazer group as well, which I know that a lot of employers, especially any of you that's on the call today that's dealing with significant employer engagement, these are types of things that those employers are definitely interested in hearing about. And at this moment in time, I'm still coming to you guys as training providers, as the experts, as that guidal point of what do we do and where do we go. I've taken this from the IFA, but I thought it was really good because it does actually identify all of the key steps of that initial development phase of then submitting it for the funding and getting the funding band, and it gives a little bit of the timescales there before the final funding is going to be agreed, and essentially the assessment plan of when it's released, and then obviously when it's then open for endpoint assessment organisations to apply to be an EPAO for that particular standard, but more importantly, when you guys can actually start delivering that approved standard to apprentices and offering it out as an alternative for your employers. But there's numerous different steps, and I think what we're finding at this moment in time is it takes a varying amount of time for lots of different standards in order to get them to develop. I think the biggest question that I always get asked at this stage when I've done this workshop in a live face-to-face scenario is, do you know anything about early years educator? And I think that early years educator has probably gone through this cycle quite a few times. The standard obviously is approved, the funding plan has been allocated, the assessment plan at the moment is being confirmed, and I believe still needs to be submitted and signed off. And that's as much as we know here. We have been advised to advise on that assessment plan, but it's an advisory, and I'm sure there's multiple advisory people that are involved in that process as well. So hopefully it will be imminent, but I think I've heard that imminent for about 12 months now before we even got involved in that. So I think there's been lots of variations of what that standard would look like. There has been the paper that was produced by the Institute for Apprenticeships, and I don't know whether any of you are familiar with it, but Faster and Better, I think, was the title of the paper. We will share it with the follow-up with you, but it was all about the new rules about accepting qualifications into standards as well. So originally there was 3 core definitions of what the IFA would accept and why they would accept a qualification as being a mandatory, therefore a fundable qualification as part of a standard. They've relaxed that, and they have now stated that they will accept a vocational qualification in there as it supports and rigorously supports the off-the-job vocational training, which we might see, and again, this is just more my opinion, the opening up of new versions of standards as trailblazer groups go back to the IFA board to get approval of qualifications that they wanted originally in their standards, maybe. But this Faster Better is supposed to have sped up the process of getting standards approved via the IFA board and released so that we have those live standards there as an alternative to the SACE framework. Because I know at this moment in time, as training providers, the funding bands for a lot of those SACE frameworks, although the DFE has confirmed they will extend the continuation of those SACE frameworks until 2020, the funding bands will still remain at the reduced funding bands that they currently are at, and where there is a standard and a SACE framework running in parallel, the general theme tends to be that the SACE framework is running at a lower band rate and the standard is at a higher band rate. So for you guys, in terms of your efficiencies of delivery and your return in terms of funding, you will have a higher funding band attached to a standard as a common theme. But naturally, because it's that higher funding band, and therefore your employer's contribution, that 10% contribution will also be higher because it's the 10% of the total funding band as well. But hopefully we should start to see that process speed up, so we'll have more SACE frameworks with a parallel matching standard, so there'll be more choice available, and this is really important for your employer engagement, or more importantly for your strategy of how and when do you switch over to a standard, and what are your motivations for switching over to a standard delivery over a SACE framework as well. The middle bit, once the standard has actually been approved, is really understanding that assessment plan. The assessment plan is set by the trailblazer group. It is that group of employers that are leading with that requirement and need for themselves. So they are leading on it based on that Richards review, and they set what components will be assessed. So ultimately, for an endpoint assessment organisation, they gave us what we need to therefore go and develop. And as an endpoint organisation, you will see some variety and difference, because the models and the choice of how we apply and how we are going to assess will vary between organisation, as they do when you're picking an awarding organisation. Prices differ, service differs, and ultimately the package of what you receive does vary. But essentially, the components that you're being assessed on should not change. They will always be the same because they are set in stone in the assessment plan. So that every endpoint assessment organisation for one particular standard, so if we take the customer service practitioner, we will all do the 3 set components that is listed in that assessment plan. And we should all be checking the same gateway requirements, because the assessment plan also stipulates what you guys should be doing in terms of the on-programme elements and what's required for on-programme delivery. and ultimately what needs to have been achieved and ticked off and attained and have evidence for before you submit to your endpoint assessment organisation at Gateway to say, I'm ready to be assessed, or your apprentice is ready to be assessed. Within the assessment methods, they also set the grading. They give the rules on resits or retakes, or how that's defined, so whether there is a time period that has to occur before the apprentice is allowed to retake that particular component. How many times a particular component can be retook or resat is all set by the Trailblazer group, so it should not differ from endpoint assessment organisations. All of this should be standard because the rules are in that assessment plan. The assessment plan also gives the specific roles and responsibilities that we need to obviously manage from an independence point of view, but also from a quality assurance point of view. So they set the external quality assurer and who will actually then control all endpoint assessments within that particular sector. They also tell us, in terms of our independent endpoint assessors, or IEPAs for another acronym in education, what level of experience the IEPA should have, what qualifications an IEPA should have in order to then assess apprentices at the end as part of endpoint assessment. So there is an awful lot of structure still in the new world of standards, as there was in the world of SAFE frameworks. SAFE frameworks essentially were governed by a qualification framework and therefore quality controlled by your awarding organisation of choice, and Ofqual, because they were all regulated provision. Within this particular world of the standards, there could be 4 different EQAs, so one of those 4 will be appointed as the external quality assurance, who almost is regulating all the endpoint assessors organisations to ensure we're all evaluating apprenticeships on a national standardised level at the same criteria level and the same quality level as each independent organisation would offer. So they're the guys that are going to bring that standardisation across the sector, essentially. These are the kind of a broad definition of the different types of assessments that might get picked by that Trailblazer group, and they have to select at least a minimum of 2 assessment components. And they, as the Trailblazer group is making the decisions, so those employers that come together to form that Trailblazer group, they essentially are making the judgment call of which component out of these particular lists, or which group or combination of components, are best going to evaluate the skills, knowledge and competence and behaviours within that particular sector to show that and deem that that apprentice is competent in order to do that job role once assessed. So we have portfolio assessments, and there are lots and lots of different types of portfolio assessments that we're seeing crop up. NCFE is on the register for 18 standards at the moment, and within those 18 standards, there's no standard approach to which components are in those standards, which is challenging in itself and time consuming. But the portfolio, even in those 18, can differ from just a submission at Gateway where you upload or give us as an endpoint assessment organisation access to your digital portfolio of your learner, and our IEPA will just mark that portfolio and then grade and score that portfolio, to some of the other standards that we're dealing with where it's not just a marking of the portfolio, but it's then a discussion with the apprentice about the evidence that they submitted within that portfolio, and then the portfolio title is getting the name of showcase in those instances. We have interviews, and again, the interview component can be used in many different forms. So that can start from the very basic of just a one-to-one interview with the IEPA, the independent endpoint assessor, and that apprentice, or it can go to the other level where it's a panel-based interview. So actually, the apprentice is on that panel plus members of their employees, so it could be their senior management that's involved in that panel interview, as well as the assessor in training and the IEPA, and then it's a multiple judgment call. Ultimately, the IEPA has the final discussion and final decision on the grading, but everybody's actively involved in a panel-based interview. So there's different forms of interviews that are being used. What we are finding is there is a sequential order that seems to be proposed in a number of different standards. So they have to have done component 1 and achieved component 1 and 2 before they can then do component 3. And component 3, or the final component, depending on how many numbers there are in that standard, does tend to be the professional discussion. So the professional discussion is being that almost last opportunity for the apprentice to really demonstrate their skills, knowledge and competence to the IEPA for them to make the final judgment call. So in that professional discussion, sometimes it's a planned where they can provide notice to the apprentice. Some in the retail standards, the hospitality ones, where there's notice given about what subject areas will be discussed. In most cases, it's an unseen professional discussion, but there'll be specific topic areas that will be discussed within that discussional area. And all of this all comes from the assessment plan, so that rule book essentially of what needs to be covered and how it needs to be assessed. Observations, which I won't bore you with actually explaining that one because you guys are the experts and have been delivering that with qualifications and diplomas and vocational assessments ongoing for the duration of SACE frameworks, but observations are being used. They tend to crop up in the standards where there aren't mandatory qualifications, just as a theme from what I've noticed, possibly not a rule on there, but for some of the endpoint assessment plans for the standards such as like adult care level 2 and lead adult care level 3, where there's a mandatory diploma as part of that, where you will, as the training provider, will be doing regular observations of your apprentice throughout ongoing, like I say, framework, to establish their achievement against that existing diploma that you're doing as a mandatory. When it comes to endpoint assessment for those particular standards, observations naturally aren't being used. Where you tend to find the observation being used as a component is where there is no recommended or mandatory qualification as part of the delivery of on programme. So the observation's been put in there to assess at the end. We have end tests that are coming up quite commonly in a number of different standards, and they can combined of either pure multiple choice questions, so a question with an A, B, C, D answer, obviously one of them is right, or a 1, 2, 3, 4. In some instances, though, we are seeing the short answers. Short answer tests tend to be in the slightly higher level standards, again, as a general theme, where obviously there's a question and then there's a written response. Projects can be used. Some of these are theme projects where the apprentice needs to have that project before they approach Gateway to have done some preparation work. Some are where the apprentice themselves and the employer work on the title of the project and submit that at Gateway. So projects again vary in different combinations. Culinary challenge, or challenging myself to be able to say that tongue twister, tends to come up in the hospitality ones. And in my head, I am not an expert in this particular area at all. It reminds me very similar of a kind of a ready, steady cook or a master chef challenge where they get a bag of ingredients and then have to show their ability to convert that into a wonderful meal, and therefore showing their skills, knowledge and competence of the area. CPD logs and discussions, again, as a theme at the moment from what we've looked at and investigated, these tend to be more of the higher end, the higher level apprentice standards, where they're having to demonstrate their CPD logs of where they've attained that evidence and have then discussions around that evidence that they've acquired. And presentations as well, they're used. So these are different combinations, and the Trailblazer groups ultimately need to pick 2 as a minimum of these that in order to assess, and this is what they're developing as that Trailblazer group. They'll have many different discussions, I'm sure, on what is the best and the right and most appropriate combination of components in order to assess and finally evaluate that apprentice's skills, knowledge and competence at the end of behaviours. These are the 4 possible approaches in terms of ensuring external quality assurance. So it can either be an employer-led approach, and again, the Trailblazer group is fully responsible for selecting the EQA for that particular standard. Could be a professional body. Ofqual has been selected by some of the Trailblazers. So for customer service practitioner, Ofqual is the EQA for that. The Institute for Apprentices is also one option. They have subcontracted that out and put that out So I believe it's won awards, but don't quote me on that one. Again, I will confirm that in the follow-up. But the Institute for Apprenticeships has sort of subbed that one out. So if the Trailblazer group selects, then it is somebody else, essentially, that will be the QA for that particular standard. And then we've also got the other combination of integrated endpoint assessment, which tends to happen at that degree level, the level 6 and above, where it's not deemed that there needs to be that independent endpoint assessment, that actually through continuous assessment on the on-program, that you can still make the same judgment call at the end. The same organisation can be involved in the integrated endpoint assessment discussion or decision and outcome, which is slightly different to the endpoint assessment model, but it does tend to be more around them the higher level degree programs. So do watch out for that integrated endpoint assessment as well. I put a link on there because if you do want to read up, the IFA or the Institute for Apprenticeships does have a whole page that's dedicated to how they're going to manage and what quality assurance or EQA model is all about. And the paper that I've put on that slide as well is Ofqual's approach to EQA as well. So if you wanted to know what your endpoint assessment organisation needs to do from a quality or standardisation level, or how all different EPOs are going to be controlled, we have the conditions of endpoint assessment organisations that we need to comply with, but we also then have the different EQA quality models to comply with as well. So I think it's really interesting from your point of view, guys, to understand as well, how do we actually become an endpoint assessment organisation, or how would you become an endpoint assessment organisation if that's something that you're interested in? So there is a full guidance on the ESFA website that gives you all your pre-application guidance. What happens is when a standard is approved, so saying a standard was approved today in May, and we are May the 15th, my sister's birthday, but May the 15th today, so we're mid-month, a standard is released. At the end of May, you would have that time to submit your application for that particular standard if it was released today. Or you might think, I need a little bit more time to get all of my evidence together and put my application together, so you're going to submit the following month, so then there's a window for June. And every month there is a window where you can submit for any of the live standards. Once you've submitted in that monthly window, once the window closes at the end of the month, there's then a 5 to 6 week evaluation period where the ESFA will review all of the applications that have been submitted in that particular window and then give some feedback to the expected EPAO organisation on their application process. Then they need to update the register, which can take up to about 8 weeks possibly in this process now, before you're actually entered, if you've been successful, and your name then goes against or is attached to that standard on the register of endpoint assessment organisations. So if you're trying to locate an endpoint assessment organisation, you would go to that register of endpoint assessment organisations, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, to check who is on the register for particular standards. But I would also be speaking to your EPAO to see whether they have any intentions to put in applications for future standards as well, or whether they have any applications outstanding for particular standards. So that register might not give you a true reflection of everybody's intentions and which standards they intend to be EPA for, or are hopeful to be endpoint assessment organisations for. So in total, NCFE is on that approved register, and we're on that approved register for 12 different standards under our NCFE brand and 7 under our cash brand as market leaders within the childcare sector and that healthcare. So we've made sure that we've defined our 2 different brands. So anything to do with adult care, healthcare or childcare will be under our cash brand, and everything else will sit in our NCFE brand. Although we set up as a completely independent organisation, so we have set up a new business unit that is going to be focusing on endpoint assessment, and we have a whole team that's been recruited to just deal with endpoint assessment. So within NCFE, we have NCFE awarding, and we have our staff structure for NCFE awarding, and then we have a separate org chart with individuals that have been specifically recruited and employed just for the purpose of endpoint assessment. We have chosen to employ our lead endpoint assessors to have that quality and standardisation model, and directly employing a number of independent endpoint assessors as well. And this is just to manage that conflict of interest and independence and make sure that we have that high, rigorous level of quality on a national level as well. But we also in that team have a dedicated sales team in order to go to for your first points of queries, a compliance member of our team for anything to do with funding and compliance around endpoint assessment. So we have a wonderful team of experts on hand, essentially, that pure job role is endpoint assessment to help and advise you as well. So that's a specialist, but those company values that you just saw on the screen, they're NCFE's company values. We are still NCFE, we're just a separate business unit to the core awarding. And we have still been recruited against those core values. I myself came from that awarding organisation, have just moved over. So customer service is still at the key of what we want to deliver under that brand as well. And more importantly, I've kind of told you about the importance of that assessment plan for the particular standards and where it is really your go-to point to find out what components are included, the grading that's going to be involved, how it's going to be assessed. At NCFE, if you choose to appoint us as an endpoint assessment organisation, if we've got employers on the phone, or if as a training provider your employers come to you for that advice, which I'm almost certain they will as experts, and you obviously want to be able to demonstrate your knowledge of the NCFE EPA offer, then we have made sure that we've interpreted those assessment plans in a very user-friendly way for you to help both your apprentice, your employer, and yourself as the training provider to really get familiar with what is needed and what you need to do in order to prepare your apprentices for that endpoint assessment. So for each of the different components, we've done a comprehensive support pack for each standard and detailed it down even to the component level so that you get free resources to best interpret that assessment plan on the marking schemes and the grading and what would be a pass or a merit or a distinction response for a discussion, for example. If there's tests, then we've given at least one pass paper so that your apprentices can prepare for the types of questions that will be answered or asked and how they would answer. So we have got a really comprehensive support tool. So if you do want to find out more about our Gateway support packs and about SEPA, which is Smart Apprentices platform that we've chosen to partner with for endpoint assessment, and that will manage the full end-to-end journey of endpoint assessment, from getting your apprentices enrolled to the standard, from validating at Gateway, to booking the different components and getting all of those scheduled in for assessment, to finding out your results and being able to report to your employers on progression of apprentices. All of that wonderful end-to-end journey is all going to be managed through the SEPA platform that we've partnered with. And we can show, if you did want to find out a lot more about the resources that we've and the support and the help that we can provide you and the platform for managing endpoint assessment, then do give us a call. These are the standards under the NCFE brand. So level 2 customer service, level 3 team leader supervisor, level 3 business admin, level 3 events assistant. Actually, we're looking to come off the register for that one, so it's a little bit different. The decisions haven't been made, but we will keep you abreast of those and confirm when we send the follow-up. Level 4 project manager, which is really turning into a very popular one. It's kind of the bridge between that level 3 team leader supervisor and the level 5 operation departmental manager. Because in this day and age, we're all very agile, and we set up projects and people that will manage a project through from start to fruition and implementation, but they might not necessarily have that line manager or that departmental manager experience that they would need to demonstrate for a level 5. And this level 4 is like that bridging step between the, and very much in most instances, it is a new role to project manage, and it is acquiring the new skill set. So a lot of organisations that we've been working with have definitely looked to this level 4 project manager. We've got the commis chef at level 2 and the senior chef at level 3, hospitality team member at level 2 and supervisor at level 3. And then we've got the retailer at level 2 and the team leader at level 3. Under our cash brand, as I was saying, this is the brand that we will because of our market leader precedence under the childcare sector, and really that employers' awareness of the cash brand, we will put all of our adult care, our healthcare and childcare under endpoint assessment services under this brand. So we've got the level 2, level 3 and level 5 all in the healthcare areas there on your screen. We also have the level 2 and the level 3 in adult care, and level 3 and level 4 in the dental, which is going into development soon. Some decisions are coming from the Trailblazer group on the 22nd of this month. And we are very much, just like all of you guys that are in that particular sector, waiting the release of the early years educator at level 3, and can give you complete confirmation that we will put in an application to be on the register. Obviously, I can't guarantee our success, but we definitely will be putting an application in for that early years educator at level 3. We also know the level 4 and the level 5 in development, so we're watching those ones. And children, young people, families manager and practitioner, the level 4 and level 5, we're watching those as well. People always ask me about the teaching assistant and the teacher. Yes, we're keeping our eyes on those ones under the cash brand. And under the NCFE brand, we are aware that the customer service level 3 standard came out last week, so we are already reviewing that. And naturally, there are wider areas that we will continue to watch as the decisions by the Institute for Apprenticeships are made and new standards are released. So I've done an awful lot of talking, and it is vastly approaching lunchtime. If you do want to find out, my contact details are there. So I am Charlotte Freeman, and I tend to manage all of the face-to-face relationships with my centres in the North East area and Cumbria. You have Mark there, who has been with us for 7 weeks, so we've yet to get a picture of him to stick up there. So he's that the blanked face, green sort of Cluedo figure. But Mark works across the whole of the northwest area, that M62 corridor going over to Yorkshire and Humber. So if you're in that area, take down Mark's details and get in touch with Mark. Lisa is the Midlands, so Lisa's next one down after Mark and kind of covers across the UK to the Midlands area. And then you've got Yvonne, who is on our south tip, so she covers the whole of the southeast, southwest down there. So again, just take the relevant details down, or if in doubt, give me a call or drop me an email and I can put you in touch. If you have any questions and I've not covered a particular area, or you want to confirm understanding of anything I've shared with you today, please do just jot that down now in the question box or in the chat session, and I'll try and answer those because we've still got quite a couple of minutes left. If not, and you're more than happy to have a bit of an earlier finish and go away and grab that sandwich that you're probably dying for because we're getting to lunch, can you tell I'm a bit hungry? Then please do just sign off. Like I say, you will get a full recording of this session sent to you as follow-up with the slides. And if there's any questions that are asked towards the end, we'll also do a bit of a summary of the common questions that are asked and give some feedback to yourself. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope you found that useful. Be really good for any feedback. Thank you very much.